Yorgos Lanthimos' Dogtooth is a fascinating film. With each viewing, something new reveals itself. And for me, multiple viewings have revealed a certain critique on language and family structures and how these things might relate to one another. So let's consider the film itself. It's about a family that lives on a country compound, a father, a mother, an eldest daughter, middle son, and then a youngest daughter. And the children exist under the father's strict narrative, which states that they aren't allowed to leave the compound or have any access to or contact with the outside world until their dog tooth falls out and then regrows, at which point they can learn how to drive, which is the only way to safely leave the compound. The one exception to this no contact rule is a security guard named Christina, who the father works with at the factory that he seems to be like a middle manager at. And he pays Christina to have sex with the middle son, presumably either to prove the son's heterosexuality or to curb any incestuous relationships between the children. Because the children, while I'm going to refer to them as children, aren't actually children at all. They're all, at a minimum, in their early 20s. The children are given false meanings for words that might break their immersion within the father's narrative. So the example that I'm going to go back to is the mother defines the sea as a large armchair, similar to one that they have in their living room. Eventually, Christina, in exchange for sexual favors, gives the eldest daughter 2 VHS tapes, Rocky and Jaws, which completely removes the daughter from the father's narrative and opens her eyes to this whole world outside of the home that she never even knew existed, which leads her to pretty violently remove her dog tooth with a dumbbell and then sneak into the father's trunk, wait for him to leave for work in the morning, and escape, but her escape is rather ambiguous. I'll get into that more later. So essentially, I would argue that the confusion of signifiers in Dogtooth presents a sort of Lacanian critique of the paternalistic family structure and control over language, especially as they relate to Greece in the past decade, which has been marked by social and cultural unrest. Just for a bit of context, Greece has been going through a pretty difficult time economically and culturally over the last decade. The 2010s began for them with a financial crisis and a bevy of protests led by young people. And this unrest is tied to a dissatisfaction with previous generations' rule, which has led to the multiplication of fascist ideologies in Greece and high unemployment among young people, brutal police violence, and the impetus for the protests was austerity measures taken by the government to try to bring down their astronomical deficits. So in this we can see that there is definite, to put it in Lacanian terms, dissatisfaction with the laws of the father. So it's clear based on the climate in Greece over the last 10 years that young people are kind of aiming to rebel against the rule of generations before them. They want out from under their fathers. And Dogtooth came out in 2009, which was 3 years prior to these protests and prior to all of this sort of ramping up. This unrest definitely has roots prior to these protests. The protests were kind of all of these things coming to a head. So it's not a stretch to say that Dogtooth is perhaps a critique, or at the very least influenced by the cultural moment that we see in Greece today. And then just a little bit of explanation on the Lacanian analysis. Jacques Lacan was a pretty important French theorist. He expanded upon Freud's work and advocated for a return to Freud. But where Freud thought of the self as formed through experience, Lacan argued that the self is formed through language. So today we see his theories applied pretty often in film studies as a way of analyzing film text, the same way that we would analyze like a literary text. So for our purposes, we're going to focus on 2 main ideas from Lacan. One, the mirror stage, and 2, the triad. So the mirror stage is essentially, to put it in the simplest terms, the point in a child's development where the child for the first time looks in the mirror and identifies with their reflection, kind of their first taste of self-consciousness and understanding that the reflection in the mirror is them and that they are their own entity. And on one hand, this is a very important stage in a child's life because it is the beginning of self-formation and self-consciousness. But on the other hand, it's also the moment that the child is kind of removed from this feeling of, maybe Freud would call it, oneness with the world. A sense of being one with everything around you and kind of not having a sense of yourself and not having an ego. It's kind of the beginning of being beholden to language.
Hi, I'm just stopping in from editing to let you know the word that I'm trying to call to mind here, castration. Lacan argues that we're castrated by language because it's such an imperfect medium and it's such an inefficient way of expressing ourselves because we don't naturally want to use language. Therefore, when we are using it, we're castrating ourselves in a philosophical sense, not a literal one.
The second idea that we're going to consider is triad. And the triad is made up of three distinct pieces: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. The real refers to an object's real properties. So if we think of the example of the sea, which I referenced before in the movie, to the children, the real of the sea is that it's a big leather armchair. It's the armchair that they look at in their living room every day. And then the symbolic refers to the social implications of an object. So to the children, the sea maybe is a place where they sit and have a chat with their parents. And then in the imaginary sense, that's meaning that we make based on what something means to us specifically. It's our imagined meaning of something. So it's hard to give a specific definition for what the imaginary meaning of the sea would be to these children, but let's consider maybe the chairs where the father sits to discipline the children. So maybe the imaginary meaning of the sea is a place where punishment happens, and maybe there's a negative connotation to it. Whereas for us, maybe the imaginary meaning of the sea would be somewhere where we go and have fun with our family and our friends, and maybe there's a positive connotation in our imaginary. So all of this is basically to say that signifiers are important, and it's important to have stable signifiers which unify and reify the world that we live in order to function within a society. So to think about this more in context of the film, the confusion of signifiers is really essential for thinking about the paternal narrative and kind of the power of the father over the family. The confusion of signifiers and meanings in the film is because these meanings are defined by the patriarchal structure rather than by the socially agreed upon meanings. But why does this happen? Why do these meanings have to be confused? In the opening scene, it's established immediately that as the children all sit around the bathroom listening to this cassette tape of their mother, giving them the definitions of these words, saying that the sea is a big armchair or that a motorway is a strong gust of wind. What is the importance of this? Well, these are all words that could potentially complicate the children's understandings of the paternal narrative under which they live. Which brings us to a pretty important aspect of this film: paternalistic control of language. The impetus for controlling language in this way is, I think, pretty clear. Signifiers present a threat to the father's regime, and thus they have to be neutralized in order to maintain control. But through the daughter's transformation, which I'll get into later, we kind of start to see the importance of suppressing the mirror stage and suppressing identity formation as a means of continuing to control language and continuing to control the family. So let's consider the mirror stage and the eldest daughter now. The eldest daughter, when we first meet her, she is sitting back facing a mirror, looking out into the room, which I think is a pretty essential thing to make note of. She's not looking in the mirror. She is being given these signifiers that are completely removed from what they are agreed upon to mean. She's basically being indoctrinated by this paternal narrative at the expense of her own identity formation. And then later on, when Christina, the security guard, is trying to solicit sexual favors from her, Christina offers her hair gel in exchange. And the eldest daughter has no interest in it because she has no interest in her own appearance. She has no interest in herself as a being because she exists only within this family structure and not as an individual being. But this ultimately leads to Christina giving her the videotapes, her seeing Jaws and Rocky, and her entire worldview being complicated, which then leads to her saying to the younger daughter, "Call me Bruce," and her giving herself a name, which is a huge turning point in the movie. It's an essential moment. In giving herself a name, she's finally beginning to establish an identity outside of the family structure. Then in the final scene of the movie, she decides that she's going to leave the family home, but she's still beholden to the narrative that her father set forth for her. So she looks in the mirror for the first time in the movie, the first time anyone in this movie has looked in the mirror. And she takes a dumbbell and she smashes her dog tooth up. And she looks in the mirror and she smiles at herself before going and shoving herself in the trunk of her father's car. The father drives to work the next morning and she's still in the trunk, and the film ends with just a shot of the trunk with her still in it. The Dogtooth scene is, I would argue, a visual representation of a child undergoing the mirror stage and developing a sense of self separate from the family unit, which is something that we all do. But the fact that the film ends with her still in the trunk is indicative as well. Just because she's found a new set of signifiers and a new way of seeing the world doesn't mean that she's escaped what Jameson might call the prison house of language. It just means that she's found a new set of structures to organize herself under. So what do these things mean maybe in a larger Greek context? Well, based on this Greek unrest and the dissatisfaction with the rule of the father, we could maybe read it as the eldest daughter as a parallel to the youths of Greece, and the father as maybe the Greek government, or even just older generations in Greece, who are still trying to denote the language and the culture. But the youths of Greece have access to these outside influences. While escaping the father's paternalistic rule is a good thing, it's being replaced by structures that are already in place and not necessarily better. Maybe it is kind of a negativistic outcome to say that replacing one set of structures and signifiers and meanings for another isn't necessarily a cure or going to make everything better for Greek people or for the daughter or for anyone. That does seem to be the statement that this film is making. That wholesale replacing one set of signifiers for another isn't necessarily the answer to solving one's problems.
Fly me to the moon.
O babás mas agapay,
Swing among the stars.
y mamá mas agapay,
Let me see what spring
e mi